about 2 months ago, I asked my mom if I could move into an apartment. She checked if it was a safe place or not, and when she saw that it was, she said it's okay for me to go. She helped me pack my things, but my dad couldn't join us because he had surgery. He was recovering and couldn't lift heavy stuff. Thankfully, my mom and I were strong enough to move everything. I met the landlord, and he gave me the key to the apartment. The landlord suggested that I should meet some of the people who live in the apartments. He mentioned that many of them are very friendly. It was my first time having my own place, and I didn't have many things to move in. So, getting everything inside was fast and not too hard. Once I was alone in my apartment, I thought it would be nice to take a quick shower. After that, I planned to meet up with 3 or 4 neighbors I had chatted with during the move. I jumped into the shower, made it a speedy one, got dressed, and was all set to meet my neighbors when suddenly I heard a knock on my door. I walked up to the door and opened it. There was a tall man, maybe in his 30s. I noticed he was wet, but not from taking a shower, but from swimming in a pool of some sort of, as I could smell the chlorine on him. He greeted me with a hi and mentioned how happy he was to see a young girl like me moving in. I grinned and made a joke about feeling sorry for whoever had to be my neighbor, and we both laughed. Then we started talking, sharing our interests and personal stories. As our conversation flowed, I invited him inside, and he agreed. Once in, I offered to make some coffee, and as expected from most adults, he happily accepted. Now, I don't really drink coffee. I like tea better, so I made him a cup of coffee and myself a cup of tea. We talked about different things, and then he mentioned he had to go because he was tired of smelling like chlorine. I said goodbye. Before leaving, he said in a nicer tone, "It's great to have a nice, sweet girl like you in these apartments, not some old folks." I blushed because I'm a shy girl, and then he left. Later that night, my phone buzzed, and it surprised me. When I checked, I saw a friend request on Facebook from the guy I just met. I accepted it, and that's when I noticed his name. But then, I started thinking. I couldn't remember telling him my Facebook or even my name. For a second, I felt a bit weird about it. Then I just shrugged it off, thinking maybe I forgot to say it during our chat. Since it was getting late, I changed into my pajamas. I wore really short shorts and a crop top, trying to get comfy for the night. After all that, I just relaxed and didn't worry too much about the Facebook thing. Next morning, I collected the dirty clothes in a basket and carried it down to the laundry room. And guess who I saw there? Aaron, the guy we were talking about, wearing shorts and no shirt. I blushed when I saw him. It was kind of nice to notice he was strong and in good shape. I felt relieved knowing I had a friend who could help me out if I ever needed it. I did my laundry, and I noticed he was watching me. I waved to say hi, and he blushed a bit. He told me I could head back to my room, and he'd bring my clothes when they were done. I gladly agreed and returned to my apartment. After some time, I heard a knock on my door. I called out, "It's open." So Aaron opened the door, coming inside. He handed me my clothes and mentioned that I shouldn't leave the door unlocked and asking, "What if it wasn't me?" I replied, I'd scream as loud as possible, and asked him what he would do. He said he'd run as fast as possible to help me. Later I went to bed, but in the middle of the night, something woke me up. I heard a noise in my room, like something was moving. As I woke up slowly, I reached for my bedside lamp to see what was happening. I switched on the light, and the first thing I noticed was my clothes scattered everywhere on the floor, like they just exploded. Then, I saw a man standing there. It was scary, because I thought I was alone. But someone had broken in. I screamed, and the man looked at me. I could only see his eyes because he had a pair of my underwear against his mouth and nose, taking a big, gross breath in. Why was this guy acting so weird? He lowered the piece of clothing, and I could see that it was Aaron, the guy I had just met and thought was nice. He smiled at me, still holding onto my clothes. Then he started walking toward me and said, "I know you want me. It's so clear. Why else do you think I'm here?" "What?" I said. "I barely know you. We just met." "So what? I saw the way you looked at me," he snapped back at me. He pushed me down onto my bed, and I screamed again, tears streaming down my face. I felt foolish. Why did I let him get so close? Why did I flirt and trust someone I hardly knew? All of a sudden, really bright lights were pointed at us, and a strong voice said, "Let go of her. Get down on the ground now." It was the police. They arrested Aaron, but I felt so scared and broken. I cried all through the next day, and I stayed at my parents' house for a while after that. It was really hard for me to go back to my apartment. But there was this nice person who lived in the same apartment complex. He saw someone breaking into my place in the middle of the night, so he called the police. I can't help but think about how bad things could have been if he hadn't helped. It's a scary thought, so be careful and don't trust anyone you don't know well. And it's better to be safe. This happened about 5 years ago, when we stayed in a small group of apartments in North Topeka, with my sister, dad, stepmom, and my German Shepherd Coco. We also had neighbors like the Metalheads living above us in apartment 12, Sino in apartment 4, just one apartment away, then some weird guy named Harold in apartment 3. A few weeks before this incident, Harold walked over to our apartment and said, "Hey Rob Lowe, you got a cigarette?" We couldn't help but laugh at the way he said it. My dad, being a nice guy, handed him a cigarette, and then the two of them sat outside, smoking and talking. As they spent about half an hour chatting, sharing stories about what's going on in their lives and their families. But then, out of nowhere, Harold asked the creepiest thing. Harold looked at my dad and said, "Hey Robert, I was wondering, can your daughter spend time with me in my apartment sometime?" This really bothered me. Harold was way older, maybe in his 40s, and my sister was just 13 back then. The air around us felt weird. Suddenly my dad got up, grabbed Harold, and pushed him away, shouting, "No, go away. What's wrong with you?" Harold walked off, laughing and smoking his cigarette. Then he looked at me through the window. A couple of years passed. My sister, who was 15 at the time, went to the nearby Walgreens, a few blocks away. Out of the blue, Harold showed up and started following her. Harold shouted at her, saying, "Hey honey, you're looking pretty good today. Your dad said you could spend the night with if you want, and I've got some booze too." Our neighbor Sino, who was a cool guy, helped us out whenever he could. And luckily, at that moment, he was outside having a beer. When he saw Harold bothering my sister, he quickly dropped his beer and rushed over to Harold. Sino said, "What's your problem? She's only 15. Leave her alone, you weirdo." I walked outside in time to catch the ending of that situation, only to see Harold's face. He was staring at my sister's body. Now my sister was one of those girls who didn't develop until she was 17 or 18. She looked several years younger than her age. So this disturbed me even more. The way he looked her up and down like a hungry wolf, and he smiled, like he knew he was going to win one day. It chilled me to the bone. On the next Saturday night, at about midnight, the scariest thing happened. Thankfully, my sister was at a friend's house, and my stepmom was at work. Out of nowhere, some guy started banging on the back window, the window to the room where I was sleeping. It was a loud banging and scraping sound, like the man was really trying hard to break through the thin steel window cover on the outside. That's when he screamed at me, asking, "Where is my wife?" "I'm under my blanket," trying to stay as quiet and still as I can. My dad yelled back at the man, trying to scare him off by saying, "Harold, get out of here. I've called the police." But he kept trying to break through. I told my dad to call the police, but he said firmly, "Just stay quiet, Zach. I know how to handle this." A few minutes passed, and I heard the first rip through the steel window cover. The thing that's supposed to keep him out. Can't hold him now. I started crying. A little while later, my dog Coco came running and stood in front of me facing the window. She was growling, ready to attack the man if he came in. The noises at the window stopped. Suddenly, there was a loud crack, and we realized he was now breaking in through the front door. He started screaming again, saying, "Where's my wife? If you don't give me my wife, they won't find a single piece of you." My dad finally called the police, yelling for them to come quickly. 10 minutes later, the police arrived and started asking the man why he was doing what he did. They also questioned my dad, asking, "Do you have his wife?" My dad got really mad and said, "Are you dumb? He's talking about my 15-year-old daughter. He thinks she belongs to him. He's not right in the head." A few more minutes went by, and they found a crowbar and some sharp tools thrown in the grass. The next day, he got charged, and a few weeks later, after going to court, we learned he ended up in a mental asylum, as he had a disability, and he stopped taking his medicine. When I was 17, I did a lot of babysitting in Manhattan. Some people found it controversial since I wasn't a full-grown adult, but surprisingly, I got hired by many. I wasn't a pro, just a regular person using a Craigslist ad. My aunt assisted me in making the ad, adding pictures and sharing info about my experience. It wasn't too fancy, just enough to let people know I was responsible and good with kids. And it was the one thing I felt confident doing, even though I was still pretty young. Unlike the idea of working at places like Walmart, Target, or a gas station once I turned 18. I know it might sound a bit strange, but the truth is, I liked the idea of spending time with kids, making sure they were safe and having fun. It wasn't just a job to me. It was something I genuinely enjoyed. Usually when I chose the families I worked for, it was just one family at a time. They'd share their situation and let me know what they needed help with. Taking care of kids isn't too tricky, especially when it feels natural to you. I remember this one time, when someone messaged me through the ad. They explained that they had a son and a daughter, and needed someone to look after them. They said their son was 8, and their daughter was 9. They explained they were going away for the weekend. At first, I felt unsure about replying because the profile was anonymous. I didn't know what they looked like, and they didn't even have a name. If I remember right, their profile name was just a bunch of numbers. I don't know how that was allowed, but back then, somehow it was. I decided to meet this guy on a Friday evening. He shared the address, and I didn't check it beforehand. It just wasn't my habit. That night, my mom drove me there, and when we pulled up outside, I have to tell you, the place looked like an empty, abandoned house. Even my mom turned to look at the house, then back at me. She didn't say anything for almost 10 seconds, just stared at me, looking confused. We both thought it might be some kind of prank or joke. So she decided to wait at the edge of the sidewalk while I walked down the driveway. It was a long driveway with weeds and plants growing up through it. On each side of the front yard, imagine grass that's about 2 feet high. Seriously, like a mini jungle. The whole scene gave me a weird feeling, but I took a deep breath and walked down the driveway, trying to stay calm. I walked up to the entrance, just about 10 meters away from the front door. 2 windows were cracked, and one had a wooden frame covering it up. I peeked inside, but it was dark, and there wasn't a single light on. It was dead quiet, no noise at all. Standing there, I started seriously regretting my decision to walk down this driveway. After a few seconds, I heard noises behind the door. It was like someone playing with metal or banging it together. Then I figured out it was someone trying to unlock the goddamn door, but having trouble. Finally, the lock popped and the door creaked open. It was a man with messy, frizzy hair, wearing tall sunglasses and what seemed like a suit, a very dirty and partly ripped one. As soon as he spots me, he says loudly, "Ah, it must be you. I was waiting for you." I turn to face him, looking towards the lawn, the front yard, because I was ready to run back to my mom if things seemed weird. I nervously ask, is everything okay? The whole situation feels odd, and I can't shake off the uneasy feeling. The guy seemed a bit crazy. I mean, what was he wearing? It reminded me of my friend who had autism. She always wore sunglasses. Thinking of her made me feel a bit better as he gestured for me to come inside. At first, the things that worried me were calmed because he was surprisingly kind and welcoming. It felt a bit strange, but I started to think maybe I misjudged him, as he seemed really nice. When I walked in, he closed the door. Then, he started singing, whistling, and tapping his feet like he was on top of the world. I couldn't tell if he was just in a good mood or maybe having a trip. Right away, I noticed the floorboards of the house were making creaky sounds because they were old. There wasn't any carpet or wood on the floor. It seemed like old boards, like they tore up the original flooring. As soon as you walked in, on the right side was the staircase. The steps were just wooden, with some nails sticking out on either side, like someone had ripped up the carpet. He guided me through, whistling to himself. Eventually, he takes me to the back room where he has a light on. The whole room was empty, just a mattress with his bedding and a few pillows. Then he says, "Make yourself at home," and start skipping around the room while whistling. I didn't know what to think. This guy was making me feel completely uneasy, but at the same time, I wasn't really scared of him. Right now, he seemed like a total maniac to me, but I still hadn't texted my mom to tell her to leave yet. While he's hopping around the room, whistling, I ask him, "So where are your kids? Where are the kids you want me to babysit, sir?" Then he suddenly stops and says, "Ah, yes, just a moment. Would you like a drink? I can make you a drink if you want." I tell him, "No, I'm fine, thanks. I had some dinner and a drink before I came here." But he seems more interested in offering me a drink than showing me where his kids were. He told me to wait in his room, the big one downstairs with the mattress on the floor, while he went to make himself a drink. After a few minutes, he comes back, but he left his drink in the kitchen, so he has to go get it. On his way out of the room, he starts talking like he's calling up to his son, "Daisy, Brandon, the babysitter's here." So, I thought finally I was going to meet his kids, and that's why I came here. Once I met the kids and understood the situation, then and only then would I text or call my mom and tell her to leave. But there was no sign of Daisy or Brandon. In reality, he came back with his drink, which also looked moldy, and just sat on the mattress. He sat sipping it, whistling to himself, swaying back and forth while holding his knees. I walked a bit closer to him and kneeled down. I asked him, "Where are they? Are they coming down?" He didn't answer me. Instead, he just ignored me, sitting there, rocking back and forth, taking occasional sips from his mug of coffee. I decided to walk out into the hallway to call his son and daughter. "Hello? Is anyone up here? I'm here to babysit you. Do you want to come down?" There was no answer. There was also no light. I walked back to the guy still doing the same thing on the mattress. I told him, "Should I go up and get them?" and he turns and looks at me. He says, "Good idea. You go and get them." So that's what I do. I climb up the creaking staircase and notice there's not a single light on upstairs. Upstairs, there are doors for 4 separate rooms. One is a bathroom, 2 are bedrooms, and one looks like it used to be an office. There was no sign of a Daisy or Brandon. There was no one. Once I'm in the second bedroom, that's it. I decide I'm going to leave, so I take out my phone from my left pocket. I open the text window to my mom and type, "I'm coming back out. This doesn't seem right." Then I turn the phone onto airplane mode and put it back in my pocket. Well, as I turn around, the guy stands in the doorway, whistling and tapping his feet against the floor. I ask the guy, "Where are they? They're not up here." And he looks at me and says, "What are you talking about? They're sitting right here." He lifts his right finger and points to the old, crooked, ripped-apart bed frame. At this point, I got shivers up my spine and tingling around my head. My mom knew I was coming out, but I had to get out first. I'm 5'1" and 17 years old. And this guy looked about 40 years old, at least 6 foot tall, and seemed absolutely crazy. The problem was, he was blocking the doorway, the only way in or out of the bedroom I was standing in. So I had to think fast, really fast. I came up with the idea of going along with what he said to save my own life. I tell him, "Daisy asked for a drink. I said I'd make it for her." He looks back at me in a confused, crazy way, still leaning on the door frame and tapping his feet on the floor. When I say feet, he had these big, chunky cowboy-style boots. He looks at me and says, "Oh, well, I made her one earlier. If she wants you to make it, then that's fine." With that, he takes 2 steps back, guiding me out of the bedroom. It was at this moment where I realized I had my chance. I turned to the bed and signaled to absolutely nothing that I'll be back in a minute to bring a drink. Then I turn back to the door and walk out slowly. At this point, I was now a few steps ahead of this guy. I was at the top of the staircase, and he was still just leaning against the wall near the entrance of the bedroom door. I took my last look at him and began running down the stairs. Almost at the exact same time, I heard an extremely loud scream coming out of his mouth. It was one of the craziest screams I have ever heard in my entire life. Once I got to the ground floor, I turned the doorknob, but it was stuck, extremely crooked and creaky. I pulled it open enough, and it made a creaking noise, just like it did when he opened it for me. I ran down the driveway for my life. I used to run track and field back in high school. My 100-meter personal records weren't bad, but I wasn't wearing spikes and I wasn't wearing trainers. But I definitely set a new record that night. When I got back to the car, my mom knew something major was going on, as she already had the engine running and looked completely terrified. I got in the passenger side and slammed the door shut. Then, she pushed the gas pedal to the floor. I took one last look down the driveway before we took off. I saw the man standing there in his suit, cowboy boots, frizzy hair, and sunglasses, waving goodbye to us. To this day, I don't babysit anymore, but I kept my regular clients for another 2 years after this happened. I never took on new clients though. It really scared me.
On one of our drives back to Kansas from Texas, we had a bad trip. To me, every trip was bad, as I hate Kansas. One time, we ran over a dead body, lean and simple. It had a red and black shirt and jeans. It was a 2-lane highway going north. We were in the right-hand lane, and the body's bottom half was toward the right edge of the lane, and what used to be the head was to the left, which would have been towards the middle of the 2 lanes going north. You could tell it had already been run over several times. The left-hand lane, where the head was pointed towards, looked like someone had slung a bucket of red paint there. I'll never forget the sound of the crunching bones as we ran over them. This happened about 2 years ago, and even now I still can't forget it. I was stunned in shock. It was probably about 3 or 4 a.m. I don't know if we were still in Texas or Oklahoma. My husband used to get off work at 3 a.m., and we went to Kansas frequently to see his kids. On those nights, he would try to get off early, sometimes 12 a.m. I was always in a bad mood. It had just started to rain that night, and we were going almost 90 miles per hour, so we couldn't stop. We hadn't seen any cars going south for a long time. We continued driving at this speed for about 15 minutes when we saw an ambulance going the opposite direction. I can only assume. The truck driver called. I wanted to call 911, but I had no idea where we were. Plus, like I said, I was just in shock. I have searched the internet over and over since then to find some records, some news articles of what happened, but I haven't found anything.